So that new Superman, did you like it? I sure as hell did. They gave him back his red pants. 10 out of 10. Yeah, that's kind of a joke in the review, and I said a lot more after that, but I don't really think I needed to. Anyway, I really didn't do a ton of coverage by my usual metric for that one in the lead-up, because honestly, I wanted to just watch this one, just to watch it for a change, you know? I mean, I don't really know about you, but having the last more or less decade of Superman and DC Comics-related media, both as a fan and my professional job, mostly be adjacent to some of the worst goddamn movies ever to exist, and definitely the worst fandom fallout over bad movies ever to exist, has been a profoundly draining experience, and since they're kind of starting over here, I really wanted to do the same and just go into at least this first one as clean as I could and not be marinating too deeply in spoilers and rumors and theories, because look, if it was good, then I get to enjoy a good movie on its own, and it's already launching a whole slate of things, and we get to do all that work-related stuff after, and if it was bad, we'd have to do the bad version anyway and cross that bridge later, but it's not bad, so I don't even have to think about that now. It's good, great in fact, so I'll probably do more stuff about it now. One thing I did have in terms of immediate takeaways, apart from, again, it's basically a perfect version of itself, is that the term a lot of people keep using to describe this, and a lot of other recent movies in the genre, but especially this, is calling it a Silver Age comic book movie in terms of its aesthetic and points of reference, and I understand why that is. Silver Age is widely understood as the generic catch-all term for not dark like modern comics, but also not super old-fashioned like World War II comics, which everyone knows was called the Golden Age, which was followed by the Silver Age, so that's the term that gets used for this movie has primary colors in it. But one of the most interesting things that sticks out to me about James Gunn's approach to this movie, and several of the other DC projects he's produced and or directed so far, is that so much of its point of reference isn't coming from the Silver Age, or necessarily present-day comics, or just somewhere else in the ether. A lot of this actually feels specifically like Bronze Age DC, and a good helping of early modern age.
Another shocking twist!
Just to get us all on the same page, in superhero comic shorthand, the Golden Age generally means the mid-30s to the mid-50s, so introduction of Superman himself, World War II, and the Comics Code blowing everything up. Silver Age is the 50s to the 70s, death of Gwen Stacy in 1973 usually makes a good cutoff, then the 70s to the mid-80s is the Bronze Age, usually cutting off at 1986, when DC publishes Crisis on Infinite Earths, Watchmen, and The Dark Knight Returns, all in the span of about a year. After Bronze is modern, and also nobody really agrees whether there are more era distinctions beyond that. Like, most people just cut it off at Bronze and call the mid-80s onwards a permanent present because that's the age a lot of people who were in charge of the professional collector scene became professional collectors, so they've decided they're the end of history because of course they did, but you'll find other people who break it up by Copper Age, Iron Age, Bubble Age, Dark Age, etc. It's all very arbitrary. What's important is the mid-70s to the early 90s DC was Bronze and early modern age DC, and it really feels like so far that, much more so than the Silver Age or anything else, is the nostalgia reference point that's going into James Gunn's DC universe, at least in what we've seen of the Suicide Squad, Peacemaker, Creature Commandos, and now Superman. And that's really interesting because the Bronze Age and early modern age was a very interesting, awkward, creatively fertile, throw stuff at the wall time for DC, because it was the point where Marvel had been the dominant big idea player in the market for a long time, and they were getting really antsy to prove that they could do big things and flex different muscles than the fun heroes for kids books that they'd still been mainly known for in the Silver Age. Like, Bronze Age DC was when Wonder Woman briefly loses her powers and becomes a martial arts master, and then gets several other reboots before the full one from George Perez after Crisis, when Green Arrow was completely retooled into the leftist political figure that's now his default characterization, when the Earth 2 alt-timeline comics with characters like the original Justice Society, Infinity Inc., Huntress, and Power Girl were being published regularly, Jason Todd becomes Robin, and Dick Grayson becomes Nightwing and forms the new Teen Titans in the transition period between the Bronze and Modern Age. John Byrne's Man of Steel reboot is another capper to the Bronze Age that follows off of Crisis, and the Bronze Age Justice League is very much the version that Super Friends was building off of, and that's proved very retroactively influential via cross-pollination. The Hall of Justice is in the Superman movie. It was also the last big era for Justice League Crisis crossovers before Infinite Earths closed that up. And then the modern age brings us Justice League International, which the new movie's Justice Gang is clearly influenced by. And speaking of transition and influence, that 80s to 90s, Bronze to modern to dark 90s thematic chain doesn't just include those three medium-defining books in 86, it also includes all their direct domino effect links to biggies like Killing Joke, Nightfall, Death of Superman, Emerald Twilight, and all that business that comes after them. I could keep going, but suffice to say, seeing so much 70s to 80s DC vibe in this movie at the same point that the people in charge of this supposed universe have been talking up movies and shows for stuff like Booster Gold and Swamp Thing, that Lanterns show, makes me really interested to see what they've got cooking.
But my curiosity consumes me.
But also, Watching people, again, struggling with generational markers for comic eras reminds me of how we do this a lot with these arbitrary distinctions on chronological time in general that we ascribe great cultural importance to, but then we treat as casual and malleable. Like how we even do this with generations of people, which is somehow this very important distinction until it's not, even though generational theory wasn't really a thing anyone talked about until the baby boomers happened and there was this whole generation that was big enough that everyone realized, oh shit, this giant demographic of people are going to start affecting politics and consumer patterns as a giant block all at once when they turn 18 and have socioeconomic independence, and we're going to need a name to track that. Like, do people even know this anymore, that nobody outside of really devout statisticians paid any close attention to how to categorize each successive generation of people, especially in the United States, until it became necessary to write about the generation gap in popular culture between baby boomers and their parents, and then we kind of had to collectively work backwards through cultural references that may or may not have actually been widely used before to describe what the previous few generations had ever been called, and that's why all the names are so bizarre and dubiously sourced, like how the Lost Generation, aka people who were fighting age during World War I, are called the Lost Generation, basically only because Gertrude Stein called it that. You know, the Greatest Generation got to be called that because of a Tom Brokaw book decades later. Silent Generation literally means born between the greatest and the boomers. Not that many of you, so nobody will ever care what you think as a demographic, whereas baby boomers literally just meant there were a lot of kids born at the same time. Gen X is the first small wave of kids born to the boomers. Millennials are the bigger second wave of kids born to the boomers, and Gen Z and Gen Alpha, yeah, you're called that because people in charge stopped caring about clever names. Pretty much just like what happened to the comics.
I hate it here.
There's probably something to be said about that, actually, and how specifically Bronze Age Superman movie and a DC Universe slate of movies that feels, at least now, like it's drawing on the most forgotten, overlooked era of its own comic origins, is maybe why it might be the ideal answer for helping this now 90-year-old IP connect with Zoomers and Alphas, or whatever you want to be called, and all the other young audiences that Hollywood is suddenly panicking might be slightly less interested in the superhero genre. There's maybe some logic in that, I guess. The last 20 years of this has always been pretty dadly, like most of the Avengers were already middle-aged dudes whose central hero allegory was cops with more colorful costumes protecting you from space 9/11 to start with, and that was the central thing for so long a time. Yeah, it's probably time to pivot from that to something less favorite shirt from 2009 and energy, and it's probably a good idea and welcome that they're doing anything to make this new Superman feel more like a hero for younger people or who aligns more with younger generations. Whether or not this is part of that, I'm not actually sure, but it feels like it, even if we'll probably keep having the is this genre over or dying conversation forever because it drives traffic, and yeah. And you know, that also fits into that arbitrary generation arguments framework, since anytime you talk about pop culture and its weird love-to-hate relationship to superhero projects, it inevitably circles back to comparisons to the Western genre.
Oh shit, here we go again.
And how long that stayed the most popular thing until it supposedly wasn't, which was a phenomenon in the latter half of the 20th century based almost entirely on it being something boomers in particular were really into, which when you think about it specifically in a timeline sense it's kind of weird, right? As in, it's only really obvious because you know it's true, but you can't explain why it should obviously be true. Like, I can explain why the superhero genre blew up like it did in the 2000s and then supercharged in the 2010s, specifically for Americans and consumers of American popular media, so, you know, most of the rest of y'all after that point still.
9/11.
People were basically pretty unified on fear and anger, but divided on how to express it via catharsis, so fantasies of superhuman order keepers and justice getters provided a proxy experience of wrongs being righted detached from the unnerving moral confrontations of real-world socio-political quandaries, culminating in the arrival of Iron Man and the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which launched in 2008, the same year as the Obama administration, and with essentially the same promise to audiences and young voters alike, that we could finally root for a hero to go kick some terrorist ass, without having to feel dirty about also rooting for George W. Bush. But Westerns, cowboy stuff, that feels different, right? Like, it feels like it doesn't skew directly to the history of the people who were most into it. So, like, just as a rhetorical question, why did the boomers love Westerns? Wait, come back, don't run away. When I say rhetorical question, I promise I'm using it in the correct way. I'm just introducing the topic in the form of a question for purposes of rhetoric because it makes the narrative better. And in addition to answering the question, I think the story is pretty good, so I'm asking you to stick with me on it, okay? Okay. Also, I mean boomers as in actual boomers, not just like how people stupidly use that term to refer to any kind of shitty, out-of-touch old person, even if they're talking about Gen X beardos and mirrored Oakleys and MAGA hats, or like millennials who blew their money on crypto apes, even if they lived through the 2008 crisis and should know how that kind of stuff's going to turn out. I mean baby boomers. Generation X and millennials' parents. The people born between approximately the mid-1940s and mid-1960s as part of a literal population boom that accompanied a jump in Western economic prosperity following the Allied Western victory in World War II. Why did that generation love movies, TV, and other assorted media in the Western genre? Even more narrowly to that point, why in particular did men like my father, my uncles, my friends' fathers, and most of the other adult men of influence in my life growing up, not only meaning my teachers, scoutmasters, priests, counselors, police, firemen, coaches, just general mentor guys, all themselves grow up, or seem to have grown up, wanting to be cowboys, when you consider that most of them, regardless of where they came from, had grown up in the 50s and 60s, an era long removed from the Wild West having been anything but a historical memory, as the American dream had rapidly shifted to urbanization of labor and suburbanization of leisure. Their parents, overwhelmingly by statistic, wouldn't have been cowboys or come from quote-unquote frontier stock, and even if they had, the move away from that lifestyle, even in most of the rural parts of the United States, had been well underway since before the Great Depression. It was their great-grandparents' nostalgia at best, so why and how is it also our quintessential American nationalist period action, romance, adventure, mythology genre?
Say, Miss Ralphie, I just know those bad guys would be coming for us in the end.
Because when you think about it, this doesn't make a ton of sense. You can understand, just for one example, why Japan makes as much media as it does about the age of the samurai. Japan is a relatively small country geographically, and while there were many different evolutions of the system over time, the Edo period, or Tokugawa shogunate, lasted for about 265 years. Quite a bit of time. By most generous estimates, what history considers the United States Wild West era lasted barely 30 years, and really only consisted of events in a handful of western and southwest territories. That's not a lot of time and not a lot of space. Sure, you can expand it out if you start counting events that happened after or in the same regions into modernity or prior history, like the frontier exploration or the Northwest territories, but that's not really what we're talking about here. We're talking about cowboy stuff, and specifically cowboy movies. You know, saloon fights, 10-gallon hats, horse chases, shootouts, duels in the sun, lassos and gambling men and cowpokes and sassy bar gals, and shiny spurs and tough hombres and posses and dudes riding off into the sunsets. All of that whole business. But all that stuff, or at least the real stuff that the vague outline of that stuff had been romanticized into, only existed for a fraction of time between the end of the Civil War and the beginning of the 20th century.
And now it's all over.
And a lot of that romanticism was romanticized deliberately as the era itself was ending, in the form of dime novels and some of the earliest silent movies, as part of, for lack of a better word, propaganda efforts to encourage more and more people to keep moving themselves and their money further westward, which worked. After all, one of the major industries that relocated itself fully from New York and Chicago to the sunny West Coast was the film industry, where it serendipitously realized that one of the easiest things that California's forest and desert scenery could easily double for was anybody's idea of the Old West as described in those dime novels, pamphlets, and newspaper stories. Sure, it was less easy to make them work with early decent sound equipment, which was partly why up until the mid-30s, when the majors got a handle on that, a lot of the genre was in the form of B-westerns, as in cheaper genre films made to run as the secondary feature to major studios' main release on a double bill, but we're still talking about a huge part of the business model from Hollywood's very inception, all the way through the 20s, 30s, and even during World War II in the 40s. They were affordable to make, and there was always a surplus of actual experienced horsemen, shooters, etc. from Texas, Arizona, Nevada, and rural California itself who could be conscripted to work on them. The stars aligned, basically. Westerns were already a top genre in pulp, comics, and fiction. They translated terrifically to the big screen, and given how generally dismal a lot of ordinary audiences were about the present during the Great Depression, Prohibition, World War I, and then the run-up to World War II, it makes perfect sense that this innately nostalgic genre that itself was designed from the beginning to imagine and now harken back to a romantic vision of wide open spaces and better adventures over the next Western horizon would remain consistently popular up through early Hollywood in the first half of the 20th century. But you also have to imagine it would start to run its course, right? I also have to imagine at this point some of you are saying, there's a lot more cowboy stuff in this episode than I might have expected. And a few of you who've watched these shows before might also be saying, oh god, this is one of those episodes where he's repurposing audio from something else that isn't finished yet to do a preview show because the full thing took too long and he needed content for the slot, and for God's sakes, Bob, pick a lane. And okay, yeah, you got me on that part, but in my defense, I have a lot of bills to pay, and there is a lot of re-editing involved in these still. Plus, do you realize how much stuff there is to actually put into into a full Superman prediction reaction video, because it's a lot. That movie was packed. There was no way it was going to be ready for a Monday or a Tuesday. Anyway, stay to the end of this one for more context about all that, but to get back on track... Shoot, where was I? Oh yeah, so yes, as incredible as it sounds in hindsight, as the 40s rolled over into the 50s, it really did look like cowboy movies. While not going away by any means, we're very much experiencing a back-then version of the, oh no, we stuffed too much content onto Disney Plus, and now everyone says they're bored and annoyed with the genre, so now we have to dial it to only A-list premium IP and do fewer of them a year zone that Marvel is... you know, kind of half pretending to be in, but actually just waiting for the vibe to reset now. Like, mostly what happened was B-Westerns dried up because B-movies period dried up and shifted to low-budget full features for drive-ins, and the demand there was for different genres, so there were fewer Westerns being made at higher budgets generally, with more classy, higher melodrama pedigree for a while, but that did mean fewer productions all the same. Like, even with the literal and figurative big guns like Howard Hawks, John Ford, the Duke, and all those guys cranking their stuff out, eventually there's only so many times you can tell the same story. And yeah, by the time the Second World War had ended, and to put it bluntly so we can move off the history and stay on movie stuff, domestic futurism had swiftly supplanted manifest destiny as capitalism's general mandate for American mass-market psychology. Hollywood and pop culture, more broadly, was feeling ready to move on from the Western as a genre at the dawn of the Eisenhower era. I mean, it only makes sense in terms of generational historic connection. Remember, the actual history, culture, and regional folklore that informed the Wild West was only this tiny moment in history that would have maybe been a living memory for certain members of America's so-called lost generation, which kinda has that nickname for a reason, and a vague recollection for a small number of the oldest members of the GI generation that actually fought World War II, but mostly a pop nostalgia concept, albeit a very strong one for most of them, and all of the silent generation. Again, the names often mean things, sadly. So cowboys had stayed popular across these eras with all those successive generations because it was America's main unique mythic hero iconography during those dark periods of depression, dust bowls, rampant gangsterism, but post-World War II we had, or at least actively were trying to have, new heroes like soldiers who just established themselves as the planet's premier fighting force, new stuff to be afraid of like nuclear war, sci-fi monsters, and communism, and a whole new frontier in space exploration. I mean, this is literally the plot of Toy Story 1 and 2, remember?
2 words. Sputnik. Once the astronauts went up, children only wanted to play with space toys.
Oh, and TV, yeah, that was about to happen. This weird new invention that might make a tiny difference in how people consume entertainment. That was a whole thing. Point is, between chronological time now having separated the actual era of the Wild West from the dawn of then modernity by over a quarter of a century and climbing, it would not have been a huge shock for the baby boomers to simply not be as into cowboys as their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents had been, in the same way that, say, my 6-year-old nephew probably doesn't know who Heathcliff is. I don't think. Or maybe less specifically, you're starting to see big movie franchises that are almost 20 years old, like, say, the MCU, just not be as big a deal to Gen Z or especially Gen Alpha. Hey, don't blame the messenger. Just kind of seems like Skibbity Toilet's audience take on the superhero genre at the moment is, yeah, the Avengers are fine, I guess, but that's a thing my dad was into.
Future's now, old man.
This, logically, is what you would have expected to happen with the boomers and cowboys if you were, say, a space alien who showed up to watch this play out as a spectator in the early 1950s. They were a new generation, the biggest one anyone in living memory had ever seen, entering into a new world of unprecedented consumer power, choice, and opportunity where the Western genre, while still popular as a big lavish Hollywood spectacle for their parents, seemingly couldn't be less relevant to the world they'd be inheriting. Prime conditions for a genre that had already lived well beyond its moment to gradually recede as a new generation found new interests. But that is not what happened. Instead, the baby boomers, especially young boys, fell every bit, if not more so, in love with cowboys and the whole Western thing as their parents and grandparents had been, with Westerns exploding in popularity on television, a medium where boomer opinion was dominant from the moment it landed up through, right now still, and then bounding back even stronger in theaters with a golden age of big-screen Hollywood Westerns in the late 40s and 50s and 60s, the revisionist and spaghetti Westerns of the 70s, all that also pretty cool stuff that went down in the 80s and 90s, and I guess whatever you want to call that Taylor Sheridan stuff that's paying all Paramount's bills on cable right now.
You're John Dutton, aren't you?
Yep. Be right back.
Don't.
Okay, so you might note that this slightly lengthy digression about how a popular genre that was by all logic and likelihood supposed to decline in popularity at a specific point in time did not in fact decline doesn't offer a theory or explanation as to why that was. It is what happened though. Cowboy movies experienced a brief lull in mass market omnipresence in the late 1940s and then exploded back into popularity in the early 50s and then stayed massive for another several decades, and it's not dissimilar to what happened for superheroes in the 2000s. Like, people forget Batman Begins opened in 2005 and it didn't clear 50 million in its opening weekend. It was seen as an initial disappointment. Another Superman Returns. We didn't make it work for Warner Brothers. They did not have the sequel already set up, despite the tease at the end. Christopher Nolan hadn't intended to do the sequel originally, and the studio did not automatically go into production on another one, and some people were kind of surprised when they eventually did. At the time, Spider-Man 3 and X-Men 3 both being hits, but also being troubled productions, and nobody being sure what Marvel Studios' whole deal at Paramount was actually going to be all about, sounded like it might have meant the genre was on a downward slope, and maybe a new Batman movie only opening so-so meant it was just trying to move on and do something else now. It was the 1-2 impact of Iron Man and the eventually greenlit Dark Knight both being these exceptional culture-shaking mega hits in 2008 that really provided the reset and made the whole industry say, oh, well, okay, I guess this is just never going away to one degree or another, and then Disney buys Marvel and yeah, there you go. After 2008, not even the abject disaster of the Snyderverse, which was bad enough to destroy Warner Brothers, was bad enough to destroy the genre, at least so far.
Why do you think Warner Brothers put me behind that desk you now owe me?
So you could pitch Batman ideas to yourself?
Exactly.
So, was there a things just kind of turned around in 2008 moment for why baby boomers decided to keep loving their own grandparents' favorite movie genre well into their own adulthoods? Well, kinda. And the reason I didn't just spell out that kinda piece of it here is because, in this context, the important takeaway is that it did happen, that it can happen, and thus there's nothing that says it won't happen for Superman and company as well. My sense of things is that comic book superhero movies are just going to be with us for another long time. But also, it's because it's a bit of a long story, which I will be telling the full version of on our sister series, This Movie Exists. Eventually. One thing you can do to help speed up that eventually, watch more episodes of that show yourself and share them with all your friends. Yeah, okay, so here's the thing. Some of the audio in this episode originated as part of what is, in my own admittedly biased opinion, shaping up to hopefully be a pretty good, but definitely very long and work-intensive episode of This Movie Exists. And in addition to taking a while to edit, I also ended up in the cutting with a bunch of superhero movie tangents that were making the episode even longer, but that I didn't just want to throw out, but also didn't cut together without parts of the movie show audio for context, and then it also turned out they cut together with some not fully fleshed enough Superman thoughts, and so all of that eventually became whatever I end up calling this that you just watched. Welcome to the process. Hope you enjoy. Please like and subscribe.
If we do, will you stop talking about the process?
Never!
Anyway, like I said, please stay tuned for more, probably some more stuff related to this, more Superman, more shorter-ish beats from This Movie Exists, since that's also why these have been coming out, and I hope this was interesting for you, because it's where we're at for a bit, because folks, this cost fallacy is sunk. I'm Bob, and that's the big picture.